Hi, I'm Dr Sarah Cassell and I've brought you to Fritton St the church where my medieval church art research began several years ago. We're here to start looking at some of the late medieval furnishings in the parish church and how they might have related to the people who lived them and the liturgy. Here we are at Fritton St, a relatively small rural church some 11 or 12 miles south of Norwich in South Norfolk. We're looking towards the south of the church and we can see the south porch. The tower has several dates. The lower section may date from the Norman period. Some of the upper work is later, from the 13th and 14th century, and the octagonal section at the top dates from the 15th century. In the porch at Fritton, it's worth noting the holy water stoup to the east of the door. The medieval door was restored in 1619 and there are carvings of the names of the church wardens on it. The arch over the door has carved heads. Here we are inside Fritton St. The building comprises an aisle-less nave and chancel. There are a number of medieval furnishings still in the building. However, some elements have been restored. So, for example, the pews are later. They perhaps give us some idea of the layout of seating in a lot of 15th century churches. Before that, people tended to stand or kneel for the Mass, but seating did become popular in the 15th century and was arranged like this either side of the central aisle. And it's likely that people were seated in terms of their status and also their gender. Another feature which has been replaced is the roof. This dates from 1913. At the west end of Fritton St, near the entrance and just in front of the bell tower, is the 15th century font. It is a very typical East Anglian design and it's found in a number of neighbouring churches as well. The octagonal bowl has alternate panels showing demi-angels holding shields and lions, and beneath it has lions around the stem. The cover has been replaced and the original may have been more elaborate as a protective device to cover the water inside, which had been sanctified. The purpose of the rood or chancel screen was to divide the nave from the chancel. Almost invariably in late medieval churches there was a rood screen surmounted by a rood loft and a rood, which generally comprised of a figure of Christ crucified, perhaps flanked by Mary and St John the Evangelist. We do need to note that at Fritton, the loft and the rood date from 1913, so they are replacements. Although the rood loft and the rood at Fritton are replacements, we can see evidence that a medieval ensemble would have existed from the rood stair in the north wall. Dr Helen Lunnan has shown that the changing form of root screens between the 14th and 15th century reflected changes in patronage. So, for example, the 14th century screen at Ashwellthorpe, funded by Sir Edmund de Thorpe, reflected his individual status and power throughout. However, by the 15th century, screens were increasingly divided up into separate panels, as we see here at Fritton. They're divided by these stanchions here. And this meant that there could be collective funding of a screen, but also individual expression of piety within a particular panel, either with an inscription or very occasionally, as at Fritton, by a donor image. What's interesting is that any imagery or decoration of a screen is on this west side of the screen. In other words, facing the nave, facing the domain of the laity. And it seems that although the laity were not allowed into the chancel and the screen separated them off from the chancel, screens were still seen as communal vehicles that in a sense belonged to the laity. I don't think that they were seen as something that divided them off as such. Mary Carruthers argues that medieval culture was essentially commemorative, and that the deliberate exercise of memory was considered a question of moral obligation. The origin of the art of memory was reliant upon determining the superiority of the visual sense, and so it's not surprising that medieval devotees chose to recollect things belonging to salvation or damnation, the articles of faith, the roads to heaven through virtues and to hell through vices, and to be recalled by others in order to secure their eternal salvation, that they should choose to create things to memorise and to be remembered by, in the form of painting and sculpture in their churches. However, screen paintings of donors to be remembered and prayed for to speed their passage through purgatory are very rare. Donor presence is often indicated in inscriptions rather than images. Fritton St is the only example where the donors occupy whole panels in a surviving chancel screen. The width of the bay may account for an illusion of reality in the figures, which we don't find so much in smaller donor figures elsewhere, where they kneel at prayer at the feet of saints. At Fritton, the chancel screen is composed of 3 bays to each side of the central opening, and these are relatively wide, especially the bay at the far north end, which contains the donor images. A division across each panel carries an inscription. From the north, the first panel features a painting of the wife and 3 daughters of the donor John Bacon. The second depicts Bacon and his 11 sons. The inscription on an ornamental strip behind the heads of the donor and his wife commands the viewer to pray for the souls of John Bacon and his wife. Bacon's position is slightly more privileged than that of his wife, as it is nearer to the central opening. Bacon and his wife kneel, facing right towards the figures of the doctors of the church in the adjoining panels of the first bay of the north side of the screen. In the middle bay, St Augustine and St Jerome are depicted, followed by St Gregory and St Ambrose in the bay next to the opening. On the south side, St Simon and St Jude appear in the panels nearest the centre, but the other bays are blank. In the panels to the south side of the screen, the figure of St Jude to the south appears to be painted by a different hand, and the artist had to contend with unfinished carving. The donor panels are in much better condition than some of the others. They haven't suffered the defacing of some of the four doctors. With the exception of St Simon on the south side, John Bacon's head is the biggest within the screen, closely followed by that of his wife. And a sense of spatial recession is created by the smaller scale of the children behind the donor and his wife, whose heads are a little lower than those of the doctors of the church. And these features emphasise the impression of the prominence of the donors and their entry into a space shared with the congregation. Audrey Baker discussed the apparel of both the children and the adults and suggested that they fitted the period 1520 to 1530. The costume and colours were rendered with care by the artist, and the fur linings of their attire indicates their enhanced material status. It's striking to note the defacement of the four doctors of the church, presumably on religious grounds, as the faces of the donors have been left intact. Another interesting point is the fact that the donors are shown adjacent to the four doctors of the church who represented orthodox religion and learning. And this juxtaposition is found elsewhere in the few other examples where donors are depicted alongside saints or other religious figures. And it suggests that they're deliberately trying to emphasise their orthodox belief at a time when heresy was a dangerous thing. The wall paintings on the north wall were uncovered first in 1850. They depict St George and St Christopher. And we know that money was left by John Allwood and his wife in 1506 for the depiction of St Christopher. Further east along the north wall, near the rood stair, two smaller wall paintings were uncovered in 1913. One of them may represent Archbishop Rich and date from the mid-13th century, and the other a consecration cross. Dr Laura Varnum has suggested that wall paintings and stained glass schemes controlled the behaviour of the laity and helped to maintain the sanctity of the church, as she says, guarding against desecration. Standing at the southeast of the church, we get a clear view of a scar against the tower, which shows that there was an earlier, much steeper roof. The roof is likely to have been heightened and made shallower in the 16th century, according to a will in the early part of the century. We can also see that the nave and chancel are built continuously at the same level. Here we are at Shelton St Mary. We've come about a mile south from Fritton. This church is quite a special place, and it was primarily designed by one man, Sir Ralph Shelton. However, the tower is earlier. It's built of flint. It's worth noting the brickwork of the church with its wonderful diaper pattern. This is quite unusual in East Anglian churches, and you'll notice that the entire church has been built nave and chancel together in a continuous building project, with a clear story above. You can see that the windows are surrounded by ashlar, so stone has been imported at some expense to create the upper part of this church. The only other feature, apart from the tower, that predates Shelton's campaign is the west window of the south aisle, and Shelton's two-storey porch encroaches on this earlier feature. The south porch at Shelton St Mary was designed to comprise 2 stories, although it is incomplete, as we'll see inside. The spandrels above the arch to the entrance appear to have contained shields, although they're heavily eroded. These presumably would have held Shelton imagery. Above, there's an extremely tall niche designed to contain a statue. The upper story would have been accessed from a passageway from the tower stairs inside. Sir Ralph Shelton started the church, and in his will, which was proved in 1498, he specified that his executors should complete the church to his design. However, it is clear that Sir John Shelton, who followed him, didn't entirely complete this task. For example, standing in the south porch, if we look up, we can see that the vaulting is incomplete. The upper chamber would have been accessed through the bricked-in passageway evident at the top. We've entered Shelton St Mary through the south door and come into the south aisle. Unlike at Fritton, where there was just a nave and a chancel, here we have a nave with aisles either side, and the building is continuous through from the nave to the chancel. If we pan round and look east, we can see that where the nave meets the chancel, there was a continuous screen across the church. At the west end of the church at Shelton, in front of the bell tower opening, is the font. It's the same sort of East Anglian type that one sees at Fritton and also elsewhere in the area, in which the octagonal bowl has panels featuring alternating angels holding shields and lions. The shields that the angels hold display rather more detailed features than we saw at Fritton. Here we have 3 chalices, and the others include the instruments of the Passion, the symbol of the Trinity, and 3 crowns. Below on the stem are lions, and you might note that the font is raised on a plinth. The font is missing its original cover. Looking east from the west of the nave, it's very clear that the nave and chancel comprise a single build, evidenced from the piers and the clear story above. The only division between them is the screen. At the east end is a remarkable window with medieval stained glass. It depicts the patron Sir Ralph Shelton and his wife Margaret Clare, and also Sir John Shelton, his son, and his wife Anne Boleyn. Their representations are augmented by heraldic imagery. And it's worth noting that this is only just one element of a whole wealth of references to the donors to the church throughout the building. The nave was probably surmounted by an impressive open timber roof, perhaps an angelic hammerbeam version. However, it was replaced by a plaster ceiling in the 18th century, like the aisle roofs. We can still see part of the design in the form of the stone corbels, which feature demi-angels holding shields. Every other shield features the Shelton rebus, so it reminds the congregation of the presence of the Sheltons. The rebus was in the form of a tun or barrel and a scallop shell. The elaborate clerestory also features canopied niches designed to house statues. They're located above the piers, below alternate angelic corbels. In addition to the heraldry and other Shelton imagery of the east window and the Shelton rebus in the stone corbels, the laity were also reminded of the Shelton patronage of the church by the top lights of the aisle windows, which also feature the tun and the shell of the Shelton rebus. Let's go to the east of the nave and have a quick look at the screen. The open impression of the church at Shelton St Mary is exacerbated by the damage to the screen, which was clearly continuous across the aisles and the nave. Only the bottom part, the dado, remains, and it lacks any evidence of the painting of the panels that we saw at Fritton. When we look above, on the north wall, we can clearly see evidence of the rood stair that led up to the rood loft, which would have been above the screen. As we've seen, the church is saturated with Shelton imagery. The central window at the east end of the chancel is inundated with this imagery, probably under the patronage of Sir John Shelton between 1512 and 1520. Above, Sir Ralph Shelton kneels, hands clasped in prayer, facing south across a restored panel depicting the Virgin Mary, towards his wife, Margaret Clare, who faces him in a similar pose. Sir Ralph's armour is decorated clearly with the blue and gold Shelton arms and colourful heraldry relating to the Sheltons. Lady Margaret's cloak bears family arms, and their family alliances appear immediately below the figures of the couple. Underneath, individual kneeling figures of Sir John and Lady Anne flank a central pane containing their representation together. Their individual representations and compositions echo those of Sir John's parents above in almost every respect, and similarly incorporate their respective family arms, which are also repeated below them conjoined. There does not appear to be any particularly individualised treatment of facial features at work in any of these donor representations, but they all feature a high degree of modelling in the cheaper uncoloured glass, suggesting the influence of panel painting. The union of Shelton and Boleyn is sealed in the central pane, in which their rich red attire, his with fur lining, shares the homogeneity of that in the south window images that we're going to see in a minute. The couple face each other in an identical setting, kneeling in mirrored attitudes under the Shelton arms. The representations of Sir John Shelton and his wife Anne Boleyn in the east window of the south chancel aisle have been attributed to possibly later German work, and they are particularly convincing as serious portraits, perhaps in part due to their later date. In the pane to the left, Sir John kneels facing his wife to the south, hands joined in prayer, and his individualised facial features in a three-quarter view are modelled with care, as are the details of the monochrome room interior of the background and the views through the windows. In a pane to the viewer's right, Lady Shelton faces her husband to the north, again kneeling in an attitude of prayer within a similarly credible interior space. However, regardless of their ostensible realism, the identification of these figures rests above all upon their association with family heraldry inserted later into the designs. The Shelton cross and the Boleyn balls appear in shields to the right of the male and the left of the female respectively, and their colours gain immediate attention within designs which, apart from the red of the donor's attire, are otherwise monochrome. Underneath, Shelton heraldry and representations of the family rebus underline the association. It seems no coincidence to me that the local landowner John Bacon chose the chancel screen at nearby Fritton St to locate his donor imagery at approximately the same date as Sir John's funding of the chancel window at Shelton. John Bacon was associated with Harleston and may have owned property elsewhere locally. The evidence for his link with Harleston is augmented by Francis Bloomfield's findings with regard to the impressive church of Bredenhall St Mary, which operated originally as the parish church of Harleston, but suffered severe damage in a storm in 1616. Dating the church from about 1460 to 1520, Francis Bloomfield cites legacies by Thomas Bacon in 1492 and by a John Bacon in 1511. So the Bacons were clearly competing with the upper echelons of local society in their donations. Bloomfield records John de la Pole, the Lord of Wingfield Castle, as a principal benefactor, and Sir John Shelton as another contributor to the work, the contribution of another member of the Shelton family, the rector, evidenced apparently by the carving of the Shelton rebus on the southeast spire at Bredenhall. At Fritton, perhaps, Bacon was a bigger fish in a smaller pond. He might have lacked family heraldry or the resources to stamp his mark upon the entire church, as Shelton did, but he was able to ensure that he and his family were represented in a relatively prominent fashion, as close to the East End as possible for the laity, in a form of portraiture comparable to that of the Shelton glass. As I noted earlier, Sir Ralph Shelton initiated the building and furnishing of Shelton St Mary. Although aspects of the design that he envisaged were never completed, most of the surviving medieval glass features imagery related to the Shelton family, from the repeated depictions of the Shelton rebus in the top lights of the aisle windows to the figures and arms in the central and southeast windows. These Shelton references are augmented elsewhere, as in the stone roof corbels and on the tombs. As Richard Marks has observed, the preponderance of such imagery in individually sponsored church projects like that at Shelton could almost create the effect of a family mausoleum rather than a parish church, illustrating the impact of patronage upon church architecture and furnishings. The northeast window is an exception at Shelton in its predominantly, albeit not entirely, religious imagery. The tracery lights in the smaller figures consist of medieval glass, including representations of angels and the Virgin Mary. The main panels depict a large female figure and a fragmentary resurrection scene, and this early 16th century English glass painting was influenced by North European continental work. Generally, biblical themes, depictions of saints, liturgical and other religious subjects comprised much window imagery, alongside heraldic, historical and other secular images. Richard Marx has outlined the importance of light as a signifier of God's presence to the medieval congregation. As he describes, medieval church windows could also facilitate meditation or instruction. Unified iconographical programmes were rare. Subjects derived from various sources, such as Dvoragin's Golden Legend, and, as Marx observes, patrons generally determined the subjects depicted. The saturation of the church at Shelton with Shelton family imagery reaches its climax in the chancel, their private domain, not only within the glass, but also within 3 tomb chests. The earliest of these is to the south of the altar. The later tombs are to the north of the altar and at the east end of the north aisle. The tomb to the north of the altar features incomplete canopy work, and it's an indication of the fact that the ambitions of the Sheltons, which Ralph Shelton expressed so strongly in his will, petered out during the 16th century. Behind the altar is a door to the sacristy, and we'll just take a look inside. There's another door into the sacristy from the southeast of the exterior of the church, and this space would have been used for the housing of vestments and plate. It's quite a rare addition to the church in this position. At the east end of the church is the sacristy, an unusual feature here, with the doorway to the south and a window flanked by niches below the east window of the chancel. I hope you've enjoyed this short tour of 2 South Norfolk churches about a mile away from each other. Although they're very different in many respects, neither has the physical scale of a lot of West Norfolk churches of the period, but we've certainly seen grand ambition on the part of Sir Ralph Shelton here at Shelton St Mary. Both churches illustrate the impact of the liturgy, religious belief and patronage upon their design and their furnishings. If you're interested to find out more, we've added some links at the end of the video for you to follow up. Thank you very much.